In this episode, we get to sit down and talk to Mr. Alex Paradies from TapRooT once again. And the topic today is a really good one, and it's one that I've been wanting to tackle with him for a little while now. And he suggested this as a potential topic. And when we started exploring it, it just kind of took on a life of its own. I love where it went, and I hope you will enjoy the conversation as much as I did. So let's get into this conversation about normalization of deviation with Mr. Alex Paradies. Before we get into today's topic, I have one question for you. Are you still painting your floors for 5S markings, things like that? Don't do that. Head over to mightylinetape.com/podcast. A great partner in safety. They've been with us from the beginning. They have some really good products that are going to get you out of a whole lot of time, material, and maintenance and upkeep. Their floor marking tape is second to none. It takes up easily, doesn't leave a sticky residue. They've got floor tape with beveled edges for forklift traffic, carts, things like that. So it really holds up well to that kind of traffic in your facility. They also can do custom floor signs. If you have a particular logo or a message, they can make that happen. Get a free sample and try it for yourself. Again, head over to mightylinetape.com/podcast. Tell them that we sent you. You will get a free sample to try out in your facility today. Again, mightylinetape.com/podcast. All right, Alex Paradies from TapRooT, right? As we know you from TapRooT. And third time being back on the podcast, which
third
is
time's
good.
Charm.
That's right. That's right. We're going to keep it going. And this is an interesting topic. And we were I know I was anyway, kind of going back and forth on like a couple of different topics. And I think the answer is talk about all of them eventually. But this one is the normalization of deviation. That's a weird phrase to say, right?
Yep.
So what are we talking about in context of workplace, incidents or errors, I should say, or like what is it? Let's define what this is.
So the first thing I want you to think back to a time and maybe a story in your head where you saw a manager somebody taking a shortcut. Can you think of anything like that where you saw a manager that was just, oh, we're going to bypass this safeguard today? Now, in that, they probably had a reason, right? There was some time pressure, there was some, extenuating circumstances why it was okay to break that rule today. But by doing that, by demonstrating that it's okay to break rules, you've set a precedent now among your workers, right? That, well, we can break rules when we need to, and when somebody says it's okay. So that's the idea, is that by leadership slowly over time okaying the abnormal, that over time that becomes the normal process, is to take a shortcut, is to bypass something, or to run with more risk than is accepted. This term really got laid out and familiarized and kind of popularized after some of the investigations for the Challenger incident. Yeah. And so, for your listeners, if they don't know the Challenger incident very well, the basics behind it was in the 80s, there was the Challenger shuttle was going to be taking off, and it was a cold day. For Florida, that may not be as cold as the most of us are used to, but it was a cold day for Florida, and there were concerns about takeoff. There were concerns about liftoff, and specifically there were concerns about these O-rings. And they had been made aware of a problem because the O-rings were basically more damaged than normal, and they had okayed that over multiple launches. All these last launches they've been okaying this O-ring that's been more worn than normal. And on that day, there had actually been a specific meeting that had been held that said, look, we're really concerned about this, and we think there's going to be a failure. We think there's a problem launching at this temperature. And
Hmm.
the guys at NASA, the guys and girls at NASA, they decided to go ahead, and they were in their minds being cautious because they had asked, well, what data do you have to say there's a problem? And they couldn't present any. It was more of a, we understand our O-rings, this is the O-ring supplier, and we think there's a problem with this. We don't want you to go ahead. Well, that ended up being kind of prophetic. And it ends up, I believe it was like 73 seconds after launch, the shuttle explodes.
Yeah.
And,
This
you
was
know,
with Christine McCullough was on this one, right? The
Yep.
teacher.
Yep, the teacher.
We were watching that in high school. I was in high school. So
Yeah.
I watched it live on TV. Yeah.
And so that chain of events, what in the reports that came after, what they said was at NASA there was this systemic lack of following the rules, that they were bending them over time, and that so much bending over time, the rule became to not follow the rule, and that their risk tolerance grew and grew. But when I think about this problem, the idea that you have to do there's some social process that we normalize breaking rules, I actually think that normalization of deviation is a misnomer.
Okay.
I don't think there was anything special that NASA was doing that led them to break rules. In fact, if you look at the way people work, you know, how often do people actually follow the rules, and which rules actually get followed? You know, I like to ask my students in the class, I say, raise your hand if you've broken the speed limit recently, if you drove above the speed limit. Everyone raises their hand. I don't care if this is a conference of all safety people. I don't care if it's all management. Everyone raises their hand. So even people that are the experts in risk management, right? We hope we are, right? At safety, still break a known rule. And when you look at the data, when you look at the research on behaviors, it is the norm. It's the norm that people break rules. It's not an abnormal situation. There's nothing special you need to do to get people to break rules. So this kind of leads us into, well, what do we do about it?
Right. I was going to ask, like, okay, so if I think in terms of what can we expect to happen, and if that's the expectation, because we're human, right? And it's not because we're bad actors or we have ill intent. It's that I could get two more done at a time doing it this way. We're really busy, and I know it's important to the business. I have a hot order. This customer, something happened, and they need to reorder this thing, and it's like really important to them. And so there's usually, like you said, there's a reason. Whether it's right or wrong is not what we're talking about, but what drives the behavior. So if that's if we can expect that was going to be my next question. Like, okay, what do we do with this info now? How do we manage this?
So the simple answer is, the thing we have to do is we have to normalize excellence. We have to normalize following the rules. And that is a cultural normalization process. It's not a normal state that people follow rules and are high performers. That is something that you have to build and develop. And there's a couple things you can actually do in order to build these. And I think the first step is to recognize it. When you've got to understand that deviation is normal and that you actually have to go out of your way to fix it. That it has to be a focused thing from a leadership level to fix it. A lot of times people put the onus on the guy breaking the rule. Well, we put a rule there and it was him. But in reality, when you think about culture, when you think about how people follow rules, it's leadership that sets the standard. And it's leadership that sets the expectation for what we care about and what we're going to do. So the first thing that leadership has to understand is they has to understand it's their responsibility. Now, We talk a lot in TapRooT and Mark, myself, and a couple others. We talk about Admiral Rickover. Have you ever heard of Admiral Rickover?
Yeah. Yeah.
So he's kind of credited as the father of the modern nuclear navy, and he really is the father of the nuclear navy. But he really set kind of a precedence for the first high reliability organization. And he's quoted as saying, nothing was final, and that's the hardest lesson to learn. No matter how firm or how formally procedures were promulgated, the insidious and subtle process of erosion sets in at once. Only the commanding officer can stop the process. So you have this idea that leadership has to have responsibility for the culture of the organization, for setting that standard of excellence and not letting people compromise that. And so that has to start at the top of an organization. You can't expect us to be a rule-following organization by starting in the middle or at the bottom. It has to go to the commandings. And the way he kind of would lay this out, he called it total responsibility. And the idea is the commanding officer is responsible for the ship. Now, he can delegate responsibility to others, but his portion is not diminished. So he can give responsibility of the reactor and the engineering department to the chief engineer. And that chief engineer can delegate that to the engineering officer of the watch for a shift. He's responsible for plant operations. And that engineering officer can give reactor control responsibility to the reactor operator. But at the end of the day, the functioning of that reactor is the responsibility of the reactor operator, the engineering officer, the chief engineer, and the commanding officer. So that it goes all the way. And even though he is not the one pushing the buttons, the commanding officer is ultimately responsible for the duties of all of those below them and making sure that everyone below him follows that. So that area of responsibility and understanding where responsibility comes from an organization is, I think, the first critical step in understanding this.
Wow. So, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of cases or instances that I've dealt with in the past as well. And, even more recently, where somebody will say, we need to make a change in the workplace. And everybody will say, well, wait a minute, then that means they're going to have to redirect traffic in the facility to go one way down this way because you're going to widen the production area, and you're going to go to a single lane of travel instead of 2 lanes. So that means it's going to be one way. And everyone will go, there's no way that's going to happen. Like, they're not going to enforce that. And it's because I think of what you said, right? That is because the normal is actually, it's because they're so accustomed to not following the rules. Like that's they just expect that. And so when they actually created a situation that requires 100%, discipline of following a procedure, everyone's like, we can't do that because there's just no way we're going to do that. And that starts at the top. What you're saying is leadership sets that tone, right? Yeah. It isn't that the workers have normalized this. It was permitted. I guess the old phrase, what you permit, what you condone, you permit what you condone, right?
Yeah. And so the moniker that you get, there's 2 of them that come to my mind for leadership. The first one, there's the Admiral Rickover, which is you get what you inspect, not what you expect, which I love. That's one of my favorite ones, because as a leader, if you truly care about something, you're gonna be willing to go and verify and look and make sure that it's being followed. And so as a leader, if there's a rule that you care about, if there's a rule that's important, you're gonna go and look. The other one, which is the Taiichi Ohno quote, which is the shop floor is a reflection of management.
Right.
We used to have that on my plant, on the door. Every door leading into the factory floor had that. And so every leader, you had to cross that barrier, and it was a big sign up there. And so there was a level of, at least, You lose it over time, but I always felt very called by that sign and that thinking of the shop floor as a reflection of what I am going out to do is a reflection of what I care about as a leader. And so that's something that I think matters when you're going out on the floor as a leader.
Now, I think that's where I heard the what you permit, you condone. It sends a very clear message to everybody. Oh, they're allowing us to do this. It's an active endorsement that means this is what they accept. And so we're going to rise to that level, if you want to say it that way, and give them what they expect. I used to joke when I was doing consulting many years ago that I could walk through a facility without even meeting upper management leadership, and I could tell you what kind of leadership we're dealing with just based on the conditions, the attitude of the workers, the talking and interacting with the workers, seeing how they work and the manner in which they go about their work. You're right, because it is a reflection of what they permit.
Yeah. And you want to make sure you also think about it from a leadership standard. It's not necessarily what you permit as much as what you demonstrate your care for. And I think people think leadership often, or bad leadership, is a reflection of what leaders allow to happen. But it's that leaders focus and they care about the wrong thing. And that's why all these other things fall out, because their understanding of what their role is focused on, maybe it's the production hours, maybe it's quality, maybe it's some thing that they've got to have to get their next corporate promotion. But people become so focused on those that they miss those important. And this is where normalization of excellence, the next thing that you've got to have in order to do it right, is you have to know what's important. Because leaders can care about and focus on all sorts of things, right? They have a million duties that they're given, and they have to know what's important and what is mission critical. And I think a lot of companies, they have these mission statements and these values, these slogans for what their core values are. But when you actually look at what people focus on and what people live, you can see the true core values of a leadership team. And I think first, a leadership group at the top has to establish what's important, what's mission critical, and where can we not compromise. So if you look at the nuclear Navy, for example, what they would not compromise on, they would not compromise on reactor safety. They were not going to make decisions that were going to compromise and put their sailors at risk. So that's something that you have to have a good understanding of. The next thing with that is you've got to expect variation. So again, we know that deviation is the natural state. People are going to take shortcuts. They're going to experiment. They're going to go outside of the norm. And you've got to expect variation and plan for it. What happens when someone takes a shortcut? What happens when something unexpected happens? When something abnormal comes up, what do we do then? Now, the Navy's answer was procedures for everything. That was their answer to it. Is we over proceduralize, and we have an idea of ironclad guidance for every scenario. Aviation does that as well. That's a really common thing in aviation, is they've got a procedure for everything. And that certainly works, especially when you have time. So you have to have time to get experts involved, time to get guidance and make the right decisions. And so if you look through a lot of aviation disasters, where things went wrong was either they didn't have the time to make the right decision, or when they were successful, they had these moments where it was the captain working with his co-pilot, working with air traffic control to make the right call and get there safely. And so those are the kind of things that we need to think about. Where people deviate, how can we give ironclad guidance on what to do in order to navigate it successfully? So that's something as well that we want to think about. Okay, we know what's important, we know what we can't compromise, and we know where we can be a little bit more flexible and give guidance about how to get back on path.
It sounds like a process. We have a process to try things under controlled settings, to get the right stakeholders involved. Like you said, experts that come in. You have safety, you have engineering, you have, a process owner comes in. Like if we want to change up how we're doing something, okay, what will it solve? How can we do it safely? It's controlled, and you have a process for that.
Yeah.
Versus, like you said, just off the cuff, I need to get this done. You also reminded me of something of like what's important. I don't know, was it Womack or was it Deming? It's one of those people, right? Said, oh my gosh, I just lost it because you were talking about when you were discussing this whole concept of focusing on what matters. And I think one of them said, focus on what matters, but know what matters first, right? Or count what matters, or count what's important, but know what's important first. I think it's exactly what that means. And it didn't dawn on me until you were talking about it, that like, okay, let's say it's safety, or it could be quality, it could be cost, or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to identify what aspect are we talking about. And of course, safety, it's risk. We're not going to put our workers at risk. We don't want them getting injured. So we have a definition around that. We can define that in some way. So if that's what's important, then everything else, like we build around that, right? We build our processes around that. And now we know what we can't compromise. So when somebody says, can I just remove this guard because we've got jams and it's peak volume, and I want to be able to I just want to be able to reach in and clear these parts or these pieces or whatever, right? We now know I can't compromise that. That's a non-negotiable. And so what I hear you saying is it's impossible to come in at the middle or the bottom and try to enforce that or try to get that. It has to come from leadership, right? Top down.
Yep. And the term that Rick overused for it was face the facts. He said, you got to face the facts. And what face the facts is to resist the human inclination to hope that things will work out despite evidence or suspicions to the contrary. So his thing was that you're going to err on the side of, and his was reactor safety when making decisions. So just like you're thinking of the case of the person removing that guarding, well, I'm just going to remove it for temporary. Well, this decision is one that puts production above safety. And is that the decision that we want to make as an organization? No, that's not where we want to compromise on. We want to think of an alternative route. And so
there are other ways to increase productivity.
Yep, exactly. Yep. And so, you've got to face the facts and make the decisions based on this. And there's actually a really good story behind this that kind of proved, that Rickover wasn't all talk. Yeah. So I don't know if your viewers know too much about the history of nuclear submarines, but essentially it was another one of these Cold War races. And the idea was that the US and the Soviets were both racing to be the first to create nuclear powered submarines because they had a huge advantage. They didn't have to surface as much. And there's a lot more that they could do with capability wise. And so both groups were racing to kind of be the first to create this. And in order for the US to do it, to win, we had to basically simultaneously create the prototype and the first working submarine at near the same time. So this was a 6-year process from design to execution and actually getting it launched. And before they had fired up the prototype reactor, they had started building the submarine. So, you can kind of see before we've even tested to see and see what problems we have, we're already building this. So what happened is they had fired their test reactor in Idaho, and they had found that there was this pipe issue. in the non-reactor steam side of the steam plant. And so basically what they had is they had the wrong steel type. And you could not figure this out with a non-destructive test. The only way you can tell what steel was which is you had to cut it open and look at it.
Look at it, yeah.
So they had a problem. They had already installed all of this piping in the Nautilus, which was the submarine. And so they have a decision to make. And this is the Rickover's dilemma here. Option one is they could run at risk. Now, all of his engineers were stating that they could run out, do their tests, get the first nuclear submarine, and come back into port, rip out all the steam condensate piping. And the risk was low, like almost non-existent, that there was going to be any problems. This is more of like a long-term operational issue that would come up after, such and such time of operation. And they could run at risk and they would definitely win. Or he could say, no, we're going to pull out all of the piping in the Nautilus. We're going to replace it all, and we're going to have major delays to do it. So what decision do you think Rickover made?
Well, I want to say, I'm trying to think back. The risk was low, right? All the engineers were saying it was low. And was there a risk to the reactor?
Yes. If these pipes had a failure, it would have been a bad failure. Not like a lose all hands on deck, but it would have been severe.
I would say rip it out, because if you put it out there and nothing happens, they're like, well, maybe we go another couple thousand hours. Maybe we, or maybe we check them and they're still fine. I would say take them out.
Yep. So that was exactly. So Rickover said, we have to remove this, because if we don't, we establish the foundation of our program on taking risks with reactor safety.
Right.
And he said that's the line we don't compromise. That's the line we don't cross. So it's extremely critical that as leadership, we set the tone for what works and what doesn't, and what goes, and what risks we take and which ones we don't. And when we take risks, how do we go about it?
Yeah.
So what do we put in place? Because, I remember my time in supervision and management. There were times you had to, quote, run at risk. Now, that was quality risk that I was dealing with, not safety risk. But as managers, you have to make those decisions of, okay, this is a customer expedite. It's got to get out. It has to be run tonight in order to be ready for setup in the morning on this critical asset. So I've got to have this guy on night shift, who I know is not as experienced as the guys on days, run this product. That is a risk. Okay, what safeguards are we going to put in place tonight to make sure that this is as successful as possible? What can we do to affect the outcome during day shift, afternoon, and night shift, and make sure that everything works the way we want it to? And so all those kind of things that you have to do as a manager, you don't want to just make those calls from a gut feeling or a what they call a inclination of hope, but from facing the facts and what is the actual understanding we have to have. Now, that leads to something that I think is controversial from an organizational level, which is leadership has to have technical competency. And you can't manage a high risk enterprise if you don't fundamentally understand the technical aspects of it. I think one of the scariest things organizationally right now is how many lawyers are and not business majors, but let's just say, people that don't have technical understanding of high risk enterprises are running those high risk enterprises and making those safety calls without that knowledge. I think it's extremely critical that leadership understands the technical aspects of the job, not just an overview of how things work, but they understand the operations, the science, the engineering behind the way that work is done. And
Now,
I
the
think you
way
can't
the work
shortcut
is
that.
done, and that speaks to drift, or, and I'm not going to say normalization because we just talked about that. That's how work gets done typically in most places. You also make me think about like startups, like when an organization expands. Maybe they launch a new location. Maybe they've built on or added on, and so there's construction, and then they're like, it's really just how, what needs to get done so that we can start producing over there. And then while we're firing up that new line, we can then finish, painting and like striping and putting the striping but you're going to put people in that process when none of that's done yet. Then why do we have it over here? Right. It's like, if it's not needed, why, so, I think you're bringing up a lot of good points that a lot of folks maybe look at a different way. Maybe they just, and again, it's not ill intent. It's just the focus is in another area.
Yeah.
And
from an operational standpoint, that might make sense. We go, okay, we can operate this with all the bells and whistles, because that's what they think it is. It's bells and whistles in their mind. But if you don't have that technical competency of why do we have all of these signs? Why do we have these light systems? Why do we have these, traffic systems in our facility? What do they do? What are they actually, not just an overview, they help give signals to operators. No, these are how operators know where to go, when they can go, who has right of way. So, you've got to have that level of understanding, because otherwise you deal with the consequences of incompetency. And that's where leaders create goals that conflict with our missions. That's where people make decisions that are contrary to, safety, risk, our risk tolerance, and lead us down these paths to disaster in a lot of cases.
Yeah. And I've heard stories where, and when I do the classes, I'll often ask, because there's always a handful of supervisors that will acknowledge this and come to this realization. I'll say, hey, how many of y'all, we have a set rate. That is the rate at which our workers can produce, given our ability to supply, the speed at which our machines work, and all that good stuff, right? We have a rate. That rate is predictable. We can forecast based on that rate. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on the back end, like output wise, that are based on this rate. So when we start messing around with the rate, think about like expectations down the line. People that aren't even in the building start looking at, you're able to achieve a higher rate now? What do you think? That's just going to snowball, right? So you're kind of creating a monster. But I've asked managers, like, how many of you all have had an operator that exceeds the rate, and then you point them out in front of everybody at a stand-up meeting or a pre-shift, startup meeting, or whatever you want to have, and say, hey, Blaine got 1.5 times the rate that everybody else normally gets. Let's hear it for Blaine, right? What message do you think that sends to me as an operator or the others? And the first question I ask is, they'll say, oh yeah, I know exactly who they are. I know the two of them, they'll get double the rate. And I'll say, how? I'll ask them, how do they do that? And they'll tell me, well, they pick the easy jobs. They take the tough builds and push them down, down to the next line. And I'm like, so they're putting one over on their fellow worker, right? Picking the easy jobs. They're rushing, they're cutting corners. Some people tell me I've seen them running, and I've had to ask them why they're running. And I'm like, okay, so now we know how they're getting that increased rate. So the rate that we establish, which goes to your technical conversation, the rate we established, it might help if these managers, middle managers, even the plant manager, right, to really understand from a technical aspect how that rate was established and why it's there. Even like breaks, having breaks built into the shift, enough breaks to go to the restroom, to get some water, because whether it's safety, there's employment related stuff built into this. There's state stuff, there's federal stuff, right? There's all kinds of stuff that goes into why we don't want to be messing around with the rate. And I often will find that's the number one call out that folks will have is, oh, we can increase rate if we do this, that, and the other, or don't do this, that, and the other. And that's the focus. So I love that technical expertise, making sure that we are exposing our managers, leadership at the site to that technical side of things, the why we have this. Not that it's set in stone, but if we change it, it has to be a managed process like we talked about earlier.
And that's where I say that's the demonstrating what you care about as a leader. You know, I do a Stopping Human Error course, and one of the sections I talk about is auditing. And I always like to ask the group, what's the purpose of an audit? Why do we do audits? As safety people, as leaders, why do we do audits? And most people's response is, we're looking for compliance of some sort. You know, they say it different ways, but they're generally saying we're trying to see that people are following rules. We're trying to make sure that the compliance level is what we want as an organization. And, you know, the first time that I taught that course was with Mark, and his response to somebody, he said, no, the purpose of an audit is to demonstrate what you care about as a leader.
Yeah.
Because what you're actually caring about is what you're going out and looking at and talking about. I had a client I was teaching, and they were telling me about they have a problem of electricians not wearing gloves. They need them to be wearing gloves, and they're not wearing them. And they've got cut hands and other little problems that have happened because the electricians aren't wearing gloves. And I say, how can we get these guys to wear gloves? And the first question I had to them was, is there a problem with the glove? Because I had, in my own experience, I had a problem of, I had a whole crew that would not wear gloves. They was in this one area and they wouldn't wear gloves. And they'd get written up for it, and still people wouldn't wear gloves. And you know, I went over and asked them, I said, why aren't you guys wearing these gloves? And they said, well, I deal with coolant all day, and do you want to have sopping wet gloves and try to wear sopping wet cut resistant gloves all day? And I was like, no, that sounds miserable. I can see why you don't wear them. So
form, fit, and function.
Exactly. So we went and grabbed we got our glove vendor in, and I said, give me every single pair of cut resistant, waterproof gloves that you've got. I want every type that you have. Find every one of them. Don't care the cost. Just give me every type. And we handed out all those different types, and we had them use them, and they picked the ones they liked. And then we broke down to those two, and we ran those two for a while to see which one everybody preferred. And we ended up with one that actually they would wear. They stated they would wear it, and they actually did. So that was my first question. They said, no, the gloves are fine. I said, okay. I said, so it's really just a matter of there's a rule and you want them to follow it. And they said, yes. And I said, okay, what does your plant manager think about this? And they're like, I don't know. He probably wants them to wear their gloves. And I said, well, if you want this to be done, you need the plant manager to care. You need the plant manager to think this is a priority worth his time, because if it's worth his time, he will make it worth the maintenance manager's time, who will make it maintenance supervisor and the crew and the electricians. If all of those managers are in alignment, there will be gloves that were worn, because every time they go out on the floor, they will have a conversation. They will give attaboys to the people wearing gloves, and they will correct the people that aren't. And it won't take long with that approach for them to wear gloves. And if you do it long enough and you care about it long enough, it will become the norm. And that's the basics of what an audit is. It's demonstrating what you as a leader care about. So if your leaders are going out and doing audits and they're little checklists that they don't really care about, they don't know why they're filling these things out, they don't have that technical knowledge, and they're just checking it off as a compliance checklist, they're not actually getting the benefit of a leadership audit. The purpose of a leadership audit is to demonstrate what you care about and what's important as an organization. That's why you should always hear those things of you should never have an audit where you don't find something, because as a leader, there should be something that you want to set an example with. That could be good, that can be bad, but there should be something you find that's worth talking about.
Yeah, you're bringing me back to my old days. Back, I had a utility crew. I went out. It was like 2:00 in the afternoon. I went and did a site visit, and I get out of the vehicle and I approach the site, and they're doing trenching work, and I go through the excavation stuff, and I'm looking at things. I noticed that 2 of the pipe layers there weren't wearing their safety glasses, and so I just went. I did the hey, and they were like, oh yeah, and they went and grabbed them, and I go look for the foreman. First thing I did, I didn't say anything to the workers other than, oh hey, do me a favor, and I said to the foreman, I said, hey, what's going on with the safety? Neither one of them had them. They weren't even on. It's not like they were sweating and they were bent over and then the sweat was getting in and then they had to lift them up for a second. Like, not, you know what I mean? No, they weren't even, they had to get out of the ditch and go get them. And the foreman was right there in the excavator looking in the ditch. I said, well, what's going on? He goes, oh, well, you told him, right? And I said, no, you're going to tell them. You're going to tell them every time. And every time I see that they're not wearing them, my conversation's with you. And so we got to make sure you can't pass that off. You're absolutely right. Because if my boss, who I've got watching me every minute of every day, isn't saying anything to me about this, then I'm not going to worry about it. And every once in a while, this safety guy comes and says something to me. We can usually roll the dice and that guy's not going to hit our site today, right?
Yeah.
So you have to make that switch. That immediate supervisor, even down to the, like you said, to the site foreman level. But you're right. That also has to come from the superintendent. And then it has to come from project managers, and it has to come from the VP of construction. Like you have to have that continuity from top to bottom. If you break that chain anywhere, it's just going to go the other way.
Yeah, and my favorite plant manager that I ever got to work under, he was so good about that. He would do his walks, and he would know he'd know when to call people out. And sometimes he would do it with the operatives, but anytime he was going to talk to an operative, when he noticed something, he first got the department guy. Whether he grabbed the ops manager first or the area department manager, he grabbed those guys first and he said, come with me. And we may not know what it is, but we're coming in to learn. And he wanted to make sure, because that responsibility, he felt it, but he needed to not just correct the person himself.
Right.
He needed to make sure we as a manager were there, not just to back him up, but also to say, hey, this is something you should have caught. This is something you should be mindful of and be watching for. I saw it this time. You are the eyes of this area. It's your responsibility to see it the next 100 times when I'm not here.
Yeah.
And so I think that mindset is so important. But I think there's a risk that comes from that too, because I think we can all think of like those really exceptional leaders that we've had that really did demonstrate what they cared about and they had the right mindset. And then they got promoted, and what happened 5 years later? I think one of the last things in getting what I think of as a true normalization of excellence, getting that foundational, is to institutionalize it. And the only way you're going to do that is to understand how you transition leadership.
Yeah.
And how do you set up and train your leaders? I think a lot of companies do what I call, a lot of it is leadership training that's focused on the legal side, leadership training that is focused on soft skills, which are great and extremely important for leaders. But what they do zero leadership training on is how do you set up the next person? How do you set up legacy in your organization and institutional knowledge? I can think of a lot of things that were lessons that were learned by my department before I was a manager. And, I was fortunate that I had a couple key people in my department that were that institutional memory. And man, I go to those guys like a sponge. Just what did we used to do? Why did we do it this way? What was the change that we made? Why did we change it that way? And I got as much knowledge of that as I could, because you need to understand what got you to where you're at. Because again, that technical competency, you're tweaking things. Leadership is always tweaking things. We're trying to get that optimum output. We're trying to get that optimum set of variables. And so we're always going to be tweaking something, but we need to understand kind of what got us here and we put this new thing in place for a reason. And now it's 5-6 years old and it's gone by the wayside, and we don't know why it was there, and we don't know its purpose. And I think that's something that as an organization I say we, because every organization, I feel like, I don't know many that do a very good job of it, don't establish a very good path for leaders for the next guy coming in.
Yeah. Wow. And so what we've talked about, the normalization of deviation, how that's somewhat of a misnomer. Deviation is, for the most part, the current state on some level, because we're human, right? Mm-hmm. And that we should be normalizing excellence, right? We talked a lot about leadership. I mean, this episode so far, our conversation so far has been really kind of heady, really not very like in the weeds. Like, these are the 3 questions you ask when an incident occurs, or these are the 2 codes that you have to be aware of, regulatory codes. So let's wrap it up by bringing it back to a technical, sort of tactical aspect. When it comes to corrective and preventative actions, or looking for root causes, or we did identify, we do have a standard, we are technically trained on it, but it wasn't followed in this case. And yes, it did actually lead to, or it contributed to, an injury. How do I write this up? How do I address that? All of this stuff we just talked about, you got to consider all that stuff. I mean, what are you going to do? Put it on the worker now that we know all this, that we're a part of that deviation of accepting that and making it the standard. And now I'm going to write Blaine up for not following.
Start writing our leaders up. That's the
okay. So how can we do 2 things at the same time? How can we got to fix this immediate thing. Like I've got this worker that's injured. I'm going to labor share another worker into that process path, because it still has to get done. And somebody's going to come in tomorrow or tonight to work second shift and work this process path. We now know we have an issue. I got to fix this. But then also at the same time, this self-reflection, this being vocally self-critical, we've got a systemic issue as well. Like, what would you say to leaders on how to handle that?
So I think from an investigation standpoint, you need to make sure that you're giving the resources appropriate to understand what's actually happening. And I think a lot of leaders imagine that investigations get done in 10 questions with a conversation and people figure it out and there you go.
I got a sheet. I just fill this out.
Yeah, they just fill out a sheet and they're done. But I think from the investigation standpoint, I think leaders need to segregate their thinking a little bit, separate their thinking. One, they need to do what is necessary to support an investigation and really get an understanding of what happened. The second thing that I think, and this is maybe even more important of what the leader should be focusing on, is when they have those occurrences where people are deviating, they've broken a standard, because almost every incident involves somebody breaking some sort of rule. That's just most incidents. They need to take a moment as a leader and look at what in their management system, what are they doing as a leader to support this, whether it's through, how are we enforcing these rules? How are we auditing this? How we as leadership have responded to the past incidences of this. And they need to focus on gathering that information and saying, what as leadership are we doing to normalize this behavior or to normalize the right behavior? And again, this is where the normalization of excellence come in. We didn't have to do anything special to normalize them to break the rules, but what are we going to do different next time that's going to make it more likely that they're following the rules? And what can I do as a leader to focus on setting our systems up for success? And so I think that's where leaders can really provide a lot of value, is looking at what can I do differently as leader, and what do I have control over as leadership that can set people up to be more likely to follow those rules in the future.
And in past episodes, you've repeated this. And so we're going to repeat it in this one. So we're going to make it consistent. And that is, you defined for us, your version of human factors engineering is making something intuitive to do right, hard to do wrong. This, even though this isn't a design process step type of thing or a physical design, this is a cultural like approach. We need to make it uncomfortable for all of us, to not just the workers, but even for managers and leadership. It has to be uncomfortable to do wrong. Yep. And we have to reinforce and make it comfortable to do the right thing, right? It should be that we should feel that, right? When we shouldn't even want to ask, hey, is it okay if I bypass these couple of things? It would never, in the right state that you're saying, this normalization of excellence, that question would never come up.
Yeah, right? That's where you have that instilled that conservative decision making in your organization, where somebody says that and you go, no, that doesn't err on the side of safety. That's against our mission. We can't do that. Yeah. What else can we do? And so what's our next alternative?
That's great. Make it easy to do the right thing consistently. So man, this was a great topic. You got me. I was quiet for a lot of it. You had me going. Good stuff. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap this one up. And organizations that are struggling with this type of stuff, obviously, you could think about these things that Alex was talking about. And I'll have links in the show notes to reach out to Alex and his organization as well to get help with this stuff. And hope, I should say. That was a Freudian slip there. Okay.
We're that ray of hope for people. I can understand it. Yeah.
That's right. But real quick, you mentioned something that's funny. Like everyone, we think we can just fill this out. Before we were recording, we were talking about this. And I get this question, the most popular question I get with any training that's associated with incident investigation, root cause analysis, deep dives, whatever you want to call it. The operations managers, supervisors, everyone just wants this, just give me the form. Just give me the form to fill out. And I'm like, no, there's a certain investment that has to be made in developing you and training and teaching you and training you on how to look for causes, how to dig and find out what actually happened, how it happened, and how we might be able to impact that going forward. So, what is it? 2 hours? Is it 4 hours? Is it a 1 day? Is it what's the magic bullet, or what's the silver bullet here for incident deep dive like training? Because we just spent almost an hour talking about some heady stuff, and it was just really just kind of off the cuff. I know we don't have a script or anything. So how would I wrap this up into training? Because this was all critical stuff. I could see my wheels were, you probably saw it. My wheels were turning. Man, I know how I could spin this into a little seminar for supervisors. Well, that's just one topic.
Yeah. So this is where, again, building technical competency and thinking about leaders' technical competency. One of the crazy things that the nuclear Navy does is they actually rotate leaders out of leadership positions and into what they had were essentially you were getting basically recertified to be able to run a ship. And if you didn't meet that period of your recertification period, they didn't put you back on a ship. And so, leaders need to be invest in their technical knowledge, and you can't just expect to do that over the phone with a little, oh, I read your little notes. That's great. I already know this.
I saw the slide deck.
I saw the slide deck. We're good. To demonstrate technical competency, you've got to go through those, and you've got to go through it like everyone else. And in the Navy, the top guys went through far more technical training. They were the biggest technical experts. The higher up you went, the more knowledge you needed, because you had to make the tough calls. And the same is true for whether it's investigations or operations. You need to invest in that upper level leadership's knowledge base, because those guys are the ones that support the investigations. So they need to know how to do a good investigation and what's needed in order to make those investigations successful, in order to know how to coach those things and give people the resources they need. So, you can't just skip on those kind of investments in people. And as a leader, you should be hungry for that technical knowledge, because it's going to make you that much better of a leader, because you have a firmer foundation and you have a new tool in your toolbox that you're going to be better at. And then a new way that you can demonstrate what you care about and what's important and what's their mission. So I think, one of the best implementation things I've done with a client is we started with the C-suite with root cause analysis training. You're starting with the upper level guys. None of these guys do investigations, but they support everything below. And then from there, they understand, oh, this is what we're doing. Now let's spread this out through the organization where we know it's important, because we know how important it is, and we can report it. And everyone below them goes, the big boss man says. So now I see culture starts at the top. It doesn't start at the bottom. It starts at the top. And the example you set as a leader is what goes. So if a leader says, I can skip steps, I don't need all this knowledge, I'm good, they set the tone for everyone below them of how they're going to respond and how they're going to lead.
Wow. I remember when I was doing the OSHA training, is code, regs, that kind of stuff. I was out at the Air Force, and I was out at Wright Pat, and we were doing a electrical safety session there. And there was a young officer who came up and said, it was this, again, same typical question, which is normal for them, is, do I need to sit through this section? Like, I don't do the work. I don't do electrical work. It was there was a general that was in the room with us. It was during break. And the general said, yeah, you know what a butter bar is? Like, this is a new officer that just got the bar. He says to him, he asks, the general asks, he says, if you don't understand what it is they have to do, how are you going to ensure that they're doing it right? And he just looked at him. And so a funnier story than that is the next session we did, that class went out, and another we were rotating folks through this class, and the next class came in. The colonel comes in, and she stands up and she introduces the trainer, and why we're all here. And she says, gotta love the military. She says, and anybody who doesn't think you need to be here, there's crayons and coloring books in the back. So basically, you're going to sit in here. You can color if you want, but you're going to sit in here. And I thought that was funny. That was probably the funniest thing I'd heard in a long time. And everybody paid attention after that. That was she set the tone.
And I bet no one used crayons.
What's that?
I bet nobody went and grabbed the crayons.
No, nobody went. Nobody got up. But I think she set the tone. She said, this is important. And, the general was correct. That's that technical expertise, that technical knowledge. How are you going to go do an audit and you don't even know what you're auditing? You don't know what good looks like. You don't know if that maintenance worker who's working on this, compressor or whatever in your facility, you don't even know the basics of electrical safe work practices. And that you're overseeing. So, but yeah, you're right. Technical expertise. Awesome stuff. Yeah, I'll continue to try to provide the best answer I can on that one. But it's the most popular one I get. The question I get: can you just tell me what I need to look for on like, why do I need to sit through a class? It's just tell me what I got to do. And I'm like, well, that's what we do in the class. All right, Alex, thanks again. It's always a pleasure talking with you about this stuff. I know we've got like a couple of other topics that we can connect on. So I'll send everybody I can over to the TapRooT website. And if they want to learn more about what you all do, they can reach out to you, and they can certainly reach out to you on LinkedIn as well. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yep.
And if they're interested in having a longer conversation about this topic, best opportunity is one of our Stopping Human Error courses. We cover this topic in more detail, and it's a really good way to have conversations on thinking about human performance and the leadership side of it and the operative side of it as well. So.
Yeah, I'm glad we got to touch on that leadership side. I alluded to it earlier. Sometimes we get into the weeds, the nuts and bolts of things, but this is so important that we get this other side right as well. So thanks again, Alex.
All right, there you go. My conversation with Alex Paradies. Again, I loved where it went. I loved the energy that we had around this conversation, just like our other conversations. Quite frankly, I love talking with Alex about this stuff, and we will definitely have him on for future episodes as well. Be sure to check out his LinkedIn profile and go to taproot.com to check out the courses that they offer, especially the one he mentioned about stopping human error. And I've got a link in the show notes, both in the podcast app, depending upon how you're listening, as well as on the podcast page for this episode. You can go ahead and hit those links there. If you want to see the full video of this episode, head on over to the Safety Pro Podcast community site. Join in on the conversation we've got going on over there. You do have to be a premium member to reply and leave a comment and create your own posts over on the community site. But there is a free account you could set up as well and watch these videos. Every single one of them is available for you to view. So I hope to see you over there on the Safety Pro Podcast community site real soon. And I'll talk to you on the next Safety Pro Podcast.